reading this morning, I have a story for you, some of you may know. The Zen Master and the Samurai. There once was a great samurai warrior known throughout all of Japan. Yet at the peak of his fame and military success, he found he was not happy with his accomplishments. He had a spiritual yearning in the form of a question that burned like a hot coal in his chest. And so he set off on a long journey across the country to find an answer to his question. Finally, he arrived at the temple of the most sought-after spiritual teacher in Japan, a true Zen master. And he went directly into the temple hall, where he found the Zen master sitting in perfect meditative posture, in perfect peace. He approached with reverence, and he bowed and said, "People say that you are among the most enlightened masters currently alive. I came to you especially from the other side of the country. Could you please give me some clarification about a question that has been nagging me for years? My question, please tell me, what is heaven and what is hell?" Without even getting up, the Zen master immediately shouts at him, "You fool! Do not bother me with these ignorant questions that you will not understand." Well, hearing these insults, the samurai, he loses control, draws his sword, and he calls out, "How dare you speak to me in this way, a great samurai warrior? I will pierce you with my sword." Without even flinching, the Zen master calmly looks up at the samurai and says, "That is hell." Well, just in time, the samurai, he understands he's been given an answer to his question. He sheathes his sword and makes a deep bow. "Thank you for this teaching." And that, says the Zen master, is heaven. At this, the samurai became enlightened. Here ends the reading. This month, we are reflecting on our own spiritual philosophies, both what we affirm and what we reject, in a series on losing and finding my religion. So this morning, I'd like to share some of how I've engaged in the process of self-reflection as part of my own spiritual journey, and how that has led me to question assumptions I've made along the way and course correct when necessary. I grew up in a congregational church, liberal Protestant church affiliated with the United Church of Christ. But my spiritual journey was really launched in earnest while participating in their Neighboring Faith program, where we explored other faith traditions as part of coming to understand and appreciate our own. It's a popular program in many faith traditions and one that we offer here as well. I was not connecting with the spiritual teachings in my own tradition at that time. I think mostly because I was really interested in mysticism, the experience of oneness with life and God. And those aspects of the Christian tradition, though well developed historically, were not discussed very often in my particular church. So instead, I engaged with writers such as Henry David Thoreau and the religious scholar Houston Smith. And they were full of admiration for Asian religious traditions. That's one of the things I took out. And I found their writings compelling and energizing, and so that's the direction I headed. Once we visited the Cambridge Zen Center down in Central Square as part of our Neighboring Faith class, about 16 miles to our south here, I was hooked. I immediately took Zen to be a trusted spiritual path that could lead me to the highest understanding of the nature of self and reality and meaning. These were important questions for me that burned in my chest like the samurai's questions about the nature of heaven and hell. And so I convinced my parents that it would be a good idea for me to take a year off before college to figure out these big, important questions, and then I'd get on and take care of the other stuff. I spent the first half of the year at the Cambridge Zen Center learning Zen meditation and devotional practices. And then for the second half, I traveled in India and sought out an audience with some of the most respected Hindu and Tibetan Buddhist spiritual teachers that I could find. On my way back home to the U.S. at the age of 18, I figured I'd probably attain enlightenment after a few more years of practice like this, at most, right? After all, once the samurai in the story was given the answer to his question, he became enlightened, didn't he? Well, it didn't happen quite that way. What an assumption, right? Now, I don't blame myself for that assumption. We come to our assumptions, we're sort of taught our assumptions. We take them in from our culture. I thought that since I had been able to ask my questions and had received answers from enlightened masters like the samurai in the story, my journey would be a piece of cake from there on out. Perhaps I learned this as an accidental side effect of excelling in my studies at school. Being so heady and intellectual myself and being part of a culture that tends to value the intellect over physical work, I reasoned that once I understood the answer intellectually, the implementation of that spiritual lesson in my life would be easy. I imagine my spiritual practice might then be something like following the bouncing ball and singing along with the lyrics while I watched a TV show, But life isn't always like school, is it? In reality, my spiritual journey continues, my learning and growth continue, and it is challenging but extremely rewarding work. As a case in point, let's take the example of humility on the table here. Intellectually, perhaps, it's a fairly easy to grasp lesson, the importance of humility on the spiritual path. How can we learn and grow? How can we connect with a whole greater than our own ego if we think we know it all, right? But as you can guess from the setup of the story here, I did not find this lesson so easy to learn in my early 20s. It started off fine, but the same humility that I brought with me to India that allowed me to be open to the teachings there was then gone once I came back, once I thought I had been taught and thus knew all the answers, right? The Tibetan teacher Chogyam Trungpa called this spiritual materialism. When our ego finds a way to use the spiritual journey to boost its own sense of superiority, it's actually very hard to avoid it happening at all, I think. In my case, my ego said, well, now I know the answers because I got them from the spiritual masters. So consequently, without really being aware that I was involved in a delusional and ego-boosting fantasy, I was feeding myself the idea that I was spiritually advanced. And this became a way of thinking I was better than other people, which is the complete opposite of where we want to go, right? But one of the assumptions that was a part of that I had to identify and question and unlearn, if you will, was the assumption that once I had an intellectual understanding, the rest of the spiritual journey would be easy. And that was actually an easier assumption, I think, for me to identify and unlearn than others I've worked through. I'd like to share one more, which took a little longer for me to unlearn, and that led me to re-embrace my own Protestant religious heritage in the process. And this has to do with the role of emotions on the spiritual path. For the longest time, I believed that dealing with difficult emotions was primarily about gaining insight into them, which is kind of a cognitive task, right? It's a similar kind of assumption. And then I could continue along with feeling loving and peaceful and happy and full of joy once I, made that insight. Assumptions I had about the process of psychotherapy as well as mindfulness meditation fed into this. But also I think it's a cultural assumption that we have to some extent that insight is the answer, or at least the most important part of the cure to emotional difficulties. Additionally, I didn't have a good model for how to work with any of the negative emotions, such as anger and fear and sadness, because the general strategy I learned growing up was mostly to acknowledge, but then to push them away and think positively. So I thought when I started in with psychotherapy and meditation in my late teens, by having some insight into the way the stories in my head and my upbringing were involved in my emotions, I was ahead of the game. I was learning a process to let them go. But I had really taken in on a deep level that these emotions were bad for me. And that belief was impacting me on a very unconscious level. So what I ended up doing unintentionally was using meditation as a means to escape from challenging emotions like anxiety and sadness and anger. What's so tricky about the human psyche is that I knew not to do this, actually. I was literally studying how to use meditation as a way of coming online emotionally and getting back in touch with feelings, with feeling these challenging emotional states, which is so important. We can't heal what we can't feel. But I had learned early on to achieve a state of very deep peace through my meditations. And while this is great and was very helpful relaxation technique, it allowed me to engage in what's called spiritual bypass. The spiritual bypass is a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. I was spiritually bypassing working with my negative emotions, with my challenging emotions. So because I was studying this stuff, I even figured out I was doing it, but knowing intellectually I was engaged in spiritual bypass was not enough to correct it, and I struggled with this for some time. Then a tragedy hit in my life, and my younger brother died unexpectedly. His name was Michael. I was in seminary at divinity school at the time, and I experienced very deep, profound grief. There was no bypassing it through meditation. I was sad. And to my surprise, though I had been pursuing primarily Buddhist and Hindu meditation as my primary spiritual practices at that time, when my brother died, I immediately started connecting to God in the way I had learned about as a child, through a Protestant Christian lens, a personal relationship with God. I had been taught that this could provide me some comfort in times of sorrow. And this type of personal relationship I was finding very comforting indeed. I was also learning in my classes at seminary that it's quite common to have certain religious beliefs in our back pocket, as it were, ready in case of emergency. In this case, when my brother died. So all of a sudden, I was talking and praying to a God that I understood from within a Christian worldview rather than a Buddhist or Hindu worldview. And it helped me get through the grieving process, which was the most important thing. And it also helped me reconnect with my own Christian heritage. At this time, I was learning through my studies of Unitarian Universalism that there was so much more to the Christian religious narrative, the Christian religious history, than we are often told. Many Christian beliefs and practices, including some that we hold up as part of our UU heritage, were historically outlawed and considered heretical, but so incredibly perceptive and valuable. I started to find and be able to articulate my own theologically positive perspective on Christianity that was distinctly Unitarian Universalist, historically heretical, and this helped me feel empowered to claim these Christian spiritual practices as my own, along with Buddhist and Hindu practices I've continued to use. I was introduced in seminary to a long history of mystical and contemplative Christianity as well. Figures such as Meister Eckhart, St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross. And these Christian mystics, as well as mystics from other traditions, helped me more fully embrace the raw human emotions I had been unwittingly avoiding in my meditations. Longing and desire, loneliness and sadness, hunger for connection, anger, all within my meditation and prayer practice. I learned that it's okay to be angry at God, that can be helpful. I learned to express pain and sadness of feeling separation from God. It was very freeing. So I did not reach enlightenment in my early 20s, but I can say I've had a rich and wonderful and sometimes frustrating, often challenging spiritual journey. At times I've felt stagnant and stuck or downright miserable. I think that's just part of what it means to be human. But then the fog lifts and my eyes open to how precious a gift and how energizing, meaningful, and life-giving the spiritual journey has been and continues to be for me. Certainly something I wouldn't want to give up and something I would hope for others including my own children. So I'd like to end with an invitation for you to think about your own spiritual journey. What assumptions have you learned that you were making? What sort of course corrections have you made? What insights into the religion of your childhood have you had? Self-examination is such an important part of spiritual practice. Let us support one another in this good work. Amen. Blessed be.